The night after my wife's funeral, I suddenly remembered the last words she whispered as she squeezed my hand. When you get home, look behind our wedding photo. Only you are allowed to open it. Alone in the silent living room, I found an envelope taped exactly where she said it would be. The letter began with the words, "I'm sorry." And then I realized I had never truly known the life she had lived. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It genuinely means the world to me. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Your city, your country. I'd love to know who's in this with me. Note this story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling purposes. Names and places are coincidental, but everything it's trying to teach you is absolutely worth keeping. The house had never felt so empty. I had lived inside these walls for 38 years, raised a son here, grown old beside the woman I loved more than I ever told her out loud, because men of my generation didn't say those things enough. And now she was gone, and the words were still sitting in my chest with nowhere to go. The last of the guests had left by 7 that evening. Neighbors, old friends from Miriam's book club, a few colleagues of mine from the accounting firm I'd retired from 11 years back. They came with casseroles and condolences, said all the right things, pressed my hand, and eventually drove away down Sycamore Street, while the October sky turned the color of a bruise. Colt had stayed the longest. My son, 44 years old, sharp-jawed, always dressed like he had a meeting to get to, even when he didn't, had stood in my kitchen washing dishes. He didn't need to wash, talking about logistics. The funeral arrangements had gone smoothly. The flowers were appropriate. He'd already spoken to someone at the bank about updating the accounts. "You don't need to worry about any of that, Dad," he said, drying his hands on the dish towel Miriam had embroidered with little blue cornflowers. "I'll handle everything." "I know you will," I said. He hugged me at the door, firm, brief, the kind of hug that communicates competence rather than grief, and told me to call if I needed anything. His headlights swept across the living room window as he backed out of the driveway, and then I was alone. I didn't turn on the television, didn't pour a drink. I just walked to the armchair by the window. Miriam's chair, the one with the worn armrests where her elbows had rested for decades, and I sat down in it for the first time in our marriage. It felt wrong and right at the same time, the way grief tends to feel. The wedding photo caught my eye the way it always did. It had hung above the fireplace mantel for as long as I could remember. Miriam at 26 in her cream-colored dress, me at 28 in a borrowed suit that fit me better than I deserved. We'd gotten married on a Tuesday afternoon at the county courthouse because neither of us had the patience for a big production. Her mother had cried. My father had shaken my hand afterward and said, "She's better than you, son. Don't forget that." I never did. I sat there looking at that photo until the room went fully dark, and the only light came from the street lamp outside. And I heard her voice, not out loud. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't losing my mind. It was memory, plain and simple, the way a song comes back to you without warning. 3 days before she passed, when the morphine was doing most of the talking, and her hand in mine weighed almost nothing, Miriam had turned her head toward me with a focus that cut right through the fog of the medication. "Harlan," her voice had been barely a thread of sound, "look behind our wedding photo. Only you." She squeezed my fingers just barely, just enough. "Promise me." "I promise," I said, "because you say yes to a dying woman, especially when that dying woman is the person you've built your entire life around." I'd told myself it was the morphine. People say strange things at the end, reach for faces that aren't there, speak in old languages, give instructions that belong to dreams. I'd written it off as exactly that, and spent the next 3 days sitting beside her bed at Mercy General, holding her hand while the monitors beeped slower and slower until the beeping stopped altogether on a gray Tuesday morning in September. But sitting alone in the dark now in her chair, With the whole house breathing quietly around me, I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I stood up. My knees reminded me I was 72, as they tended to do these days. I crossed the living room to the fireplace, reached up and lifted the wedding photo off its hook. It was heavier than I expected. Or maybe my arms were just tired. I turned it over. The brown paper backing that frames always have the kind that yellows and goes brittle after years on a wall had been partly cut away. And there, in the upper right corner of the wooden frame, something had been taped down with gray electrical tape. New tape. The kind you find in the hardware aisle, silver and industrial, and completely out of place on a 40-year-old wedding photo. My hands started to shake. Not from weakness, from something else entirely. The tape released with a soft, tearing sound. Underneath it was a small envelope, cream-colored, sealed. No name on the front. Just an envelope waiting to be found by the one person Miriam had asked to look. I carried it to the kitchen and sat down at the table under the overhead light. The envelope was light in my hands. Whatever was inside didn't weigh much. I sat with it for a long moment, long enough to understand that opening it would change something, though I couldn't have told you what. Then I slid my thumb under the flap. Inside were 3 folded pages. The paper was from Miriam's personal stationery, the cream-colored sheets she kept in the desk drawer in her sewing room. Her handwriting covered both sides of each page in the careful, slightly labored script of a woman who'd been fighting pain in her hands for the last 2 years of her life. She'd written this recently. The ink was dark, deliberate, chosen. The first line stopped me cold. My dearest Harlan, if you are reading this, I am already gone, and I am so deeply, terribly sorry. My throat closed up. I pressed my fist against my mouth for a moment and breathed through my nose until I could continue. She asked forgiveness before she explained anything. That was Miriam, always leading with the heart, even when her hands were shaking too hard to hold a pen steady. She wrote about our marriage in the first paragraph, 42 years, the courthouse wedding, the cornflower kitchen towels, the way I always burned the toast. But she ate it anyway, because she said she liked it that way. She was stalling, I realized. She was working up to something. Then she got to it. In the early years of our marriage, when Colt was still a baby, I traveled for work. You remember those 2 years you were patient with me in ways I didn't deserve. I was lonely in ways I didn't admit. And in that loneliness, I made a mistake I have carried every day since. I set the letter down on the table, picked it back up. I was pregnant. I was terrified. I could not bear the thought of losing you. So instead, I lost myself. I arranged everything quietly, told no one, and gave the baby up for adoption before I came home. A boy, healthy, placed with a good family. And I walked back through our front door and smiled and said I was glad to be home, and I have been living with what I did ever since. The kitchen clock above the stove read 2:14 in the morning. Outside Sycamore Street was completely still. Inside, the woman I had loved for 42 years was telling me from beyond the grave that she had carried a secret son for every single one of those years, and that I had never once seen it. I turned to the next page, page 3. I stared at the top corner where Miriam had written her page numbers in small, neat digits. Page 3, then page 5. Page 4 was gone. I fanned through the pages again, checked the envelope, turned it upside down and shook it gently. Nothing fell out. 3 pages numbered 1 through 3, and then 5. The tear along the left edge of page 3 was clean and straight, not the rough rip of an accident, but the deliberate cut of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had taken their time doing it. Someone had been here before me. The thought landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Someone had read this letter, removed a page, resealed the envelope, and put it back behind the wedding photo before I found it. I was still staring at the torn edge when I heard the front door open. The key turned in the lock, a sound I'd heard 10,000 times in this house, a sound that had never once made the hair on my arms stand up. Until tonight. Colt walked into the kitchen wearing yesterday's clothes. That was the first thing I noticed. He'd changed out of his funeral suit by the time he left earlier, into the gray slacks and blue button-down he kept in the spare bedroom closet. But it was the same gray slacks and blue button-down he was wearing now, which meant he hadn't gone home. He'd been somewhere close by. Waiting. Couldn't sleep, he said, moving toward the cabinet where I keep the glasses like he owned the kitchen. Figured you probably couldn't either. I was up, I said. His eyes went to the pages on the table before they went to my face. Just for a fraction of a second, a quick practiced flick of the gaze, but I'd spent 40 years reading financial statements for a living, and I knew how to spot the moment someone's attention snagged on something they weren't expecting to see, or something they very much were. He filled his glass at the sink, his back to me. What's that? Your mother left me a letter, I said, behind the wedding photo. The water ran a beat longer than it needed to. Then he turned around, leaned against the counter, and looked at the pages on the table with an expression I can only describe as carefully constructed concern. Dad. His voice had that particular softness he used when he thought I needed managing. It's 2 a.m. You've been through one of the hardest days of your life. Whatever Mom wrote, it can wait until you've slept. She numbered the pages, I said. He brought his glass to the table and sat down across from me. What? Miriam numbered these pages by hand. I laid them out side by side. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 5. I let that sit between us for a moment. Page 4 is missing. Something moved across Colt's face. Fast, controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. But there it was, not surprise. Not the confused frown of a man hearing a strange thing for the first time. Something tighter than that. Something that looked just for a blink like calculation. She probably didn't finish it, he said. She was sick, Dad. Her hands hurt. Maybe she skipped a page by accident. The numbering is in ink, I said. Same ink, same pen, same handwriting as the rest of the letter. She numbered these pages on purpose the same way she did everything on purpose. People make mistakes. Miriam did not make that kind of mistake. He reached across the table toward the pages. Let me see it. I put my hand flat over the letter. Not aggressive, just firm. The way you hold the door when someone's trying to walk through it without being invited. His fingers stopped an inch from mine. Dad. The softness had a new quality to it now, like a velvet glove with something harder inside. You're exhausted. You're grieving. And Mom was on a lot of medication toward the end. We both know that. Whatever she wrote, it's not necessarily... Sit down, Colt. He sat. Looked at me with those dark eyes of his, Miriam's eyes. God help me, every time I looked at him, I saw her and waited. Page 5 starts mid-sentence, I said. It starts with the words, and that is why I am afraid of what he might do. That's the continuation of a thought that began on page 4, the page that isn't here. I looked at my son. So whoever took it didn't just remove information. They removed the reason your mother was afraid. Colt's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped just below his right cheekbone. His fingers wrapped around his water glass like he needed something to hold on to, though his voice stayed completely even when he spoke. Dad, I think you need to rest. I'm going to stay tonight. I'll take the couch. In the morning, when you've had some sleep, we can look at this together and it'll make more sense. What will make more sense? All of it. He stood up, and for a moment, he was just my son, tall, tired around the eyes, standing in his mother's kitchen 2 days after her funeral, looking at a father he'd never quite known how to reach. She was sick for a long time, Dad. Sick people don't. My voice came out quieter than I intended, which somehow made it worse. Don't tell me what sick people do. I sat beside that woman for 8 months in that hospital. I know exactly how she was. He didn't answer. Just picked up his glass, rinsed it at the sink, and said he was going to lie down in the guest room. There are clean sheets, I told him. Top shelf of the hall closet. I know where the sheets are. His footsteps went down the hall. The guest room door clicked shut quietly, carefully, the way he did everything. Not a slam. Never a slam. Colt had always understood that restraint was its own kind of power. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. Long enough for the refrigerator to cycle on and off twice. Long enough for a car to pass on Sycamore Street and fade into silence. I read the last page of Miriam's letter one more time. She had written about Colt in the final paragraph in general terms, careful terms, the terms of a woman who knew she was writing something that might be found by the wrong person. She said she loved him. Of course she did. But she also wrote something that I kept turning over in my mind long after I finally folded the pages and put them back in the envelope. Whatever happens, Harlan, I need you to trust your own eyes more than you trust his words. You have always been the most honest man I have ever known. Hold on to that. Then, on the last line of page 5, underlined once in handwriting that was shaking but deliberate, whatever you do next, do not trust Colt. I slid the envelope into the inside pocket of my robe and turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, I stood at the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway, listening to the house. Down the hall, no sound came from the guest room. No movement, no shifting, no sounds of a man trying to sleep. Just quiet, which meant Colt was lying in the dark, too awake thinking. And we both knew the other one was doing the same. In 44 years of fatherhood, I had never once been afraid of my own son. I wasn't afraid now exactly, but I understood standing there in the dark with Miriam's letter pressed against my chest that whatever came next would require me to be something I hadn't needed to be in a very long time. Careful. I woke up in the armchair. I hadn't meant to sleep. There hadn't meant to sleep at all. But at some point between 3 and 5 in the morning, exhaustion had pulled me under. The way it does when your body decides it's done arguing with your mind. My neck ached. The lamp beside the chair was still on, throwing a pale yellow circle across the rug. Through the front window, the early October light was gray and thin, the kind of morning that doesn't commit to being a real day until well after 8. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the quiet of empty. I sat up slowly, working the stiffness out of my shoulders, and listened. Down the hall, the guest room door was still shut. No sounds of movement. But the kitchen, I could smell it before I heard it. Coffee already brewed. The particular burned edge smell that meant it had been sitting on the burner for at least 20 minutes. Colt had been up before me. I found him at the kitchen table, with his phone face down in front of him, and a legal pad covered in handwriting to his left. When I walked in, he flipped the pad over in one smooth motion. Casual, practiced, the kind of gesture that only looks natural when you've rehearsed it. He looked up with a smile that reached his eyes on a slight delay. "Morning, Dad. Coffee's ready. I made eggs, they're in the pan, probably still warm." "How long have you been up?" I asked, moving to the counter. "Couple hours. Couldn't sleep." He stretched his arms above his head like a man without a care in the world. I figured I'd get a head start on some things. I poured my coffee and looked at the legal pad sitting face down on the table. "What kind of things?" "Just notes. Estate stuff, bills, utilities, all the accounts that'll need to be updated now that Mom's gone." He waved a hand, dismissive and generous at the same time. "You really don't need to worry about any of it. That's what I'm here for." I brought my coffee to the table and sat down across from him. The eggs in the pan were cold. I didn't mention it. "That's thoughtful of you," I said. Something in my tone must have been off because his eyes sharpened for just a second before he smoothed it over with another smile. "You know me, Dad. I like to have a plan." "You always did." I wrapped both hands around my mug and looked at him over the rim. "Colt, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight. Of course. Before the funeral, before any of this, did you go into the living room? Take anything down off the walls, the mantel, the shelves? He frowned. A good frown, genuinely puzzled-looking, with a slight tilt of the head. What, no? Why would I do that? Just checking. I took a slow sip of coffee. The burned bitterness of it hit the back of my throat. Your mother kept certain things in certain places. I'm trying to make sure nothing got moved during all the coming and going this week. Nothing was moved, Dad. His voice was patient, gentle. The voice of a man talking to someone who needed patience and gentleness. You've had a lot of people through this house. Things probably just look different right now. It's normal to feel disoriented after. I'm not disoriented, I said. The words came out flat and clean. Colt stopped mid-sentence. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, not guilt, but a kind of recalibration, like a compass needle swinging before it finds north again. I know you're not, he said carefully. I didn't mean it like that. I nodded and let it go. Some conversations you don't finish the first time, not because you're not ready, but because you're waiting to see what the other person does next. He left around 9, citing a client call he couldn't reschedule. Before he walked out, he turned in the doorway with one hand on the frame and said, I'll come back this afternoon. We should talk about getting you set up with Dr. Hallowell, just to check in, nothing serious. After everything you've been through, it'd give me peace of mind to know someone's keeping an eye on things. Dr. Hallowell was my primary care physician of 22 years. A good man. A man who, if asked by a concerned son whether his elderly father was showing signs of cognitive decline following a major loss, would be professionally obligated to take that concern seriously. That's thoughtful, I said again. Same words, different weight. After his car disappeared around the corner, I went to the guest room. The bed had been made hospital corners, tight as a drum, the kind of bed-making that looks like discipline. Colt had always made his bed like that even as a boy. Miriam used to say it was one of his better qualities. I'd never had the heart to tell her that a perfectly made bed could hide a multitude of things. I went to the nightstand first. Nothing in the drawer but a box of tissues and an old paperback I'd left there for guests. I checked under the mattress, nothing. The closet had Colt's overnight bag, which I didn't open. Not yet. I was looking for something specific. The legal pad. He'd taken it with him. Of course he had. But on the floor beside the nightstand, caught between the wood frame and the baseboard, was a small torn corner of yellow paper, the kind that comes from the bottom of a legal pad page when you pull it off in a hurry. On it, in Colt's handwriting, were 5 words. Dr. H. Tuesday/Attorney Morrison, Racho. Attorney Morrison. A lawyer named Morrison. And the letter G, which in legal shorthand in the context of an elderly parent and a concerned adult child stood for one thing: guardianship. My chest tightened. Not pain, but the particular compression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he'd hoped was wrong. I stood in the middle of the guest room with that scrap of yellow paper between my fingers and breathed through it. Miriam's voice came back to me then, not from the letter, but from 20 years of watching her read people at dinner parties and church socials. Her voice quiet in my ear afterward. That one's been doing the math on something the whole time we were talking. Did you notice his hands? I'd always noticed things. I just never had reason to notice them in my own house. I tucked the scrap of paper into my shirt pocket and walked back to the kitchen. Poured the burned coffee down the drain, made a fresh pot, and sat down at the table where Miriam and I had eaten breakfast together for 38 years. I had a decision to make. Not about what Colt was doing, I understood that well enough now. The decision was about what I was going to do about it, and how long I was willing to wait before I did it. Miriam's letter was still in the pocket of my robe. I pressed my hand flat against my chest and felt the faint crinkle of the envelope through the fabric. She had left me a name at the bottom of page 5. A name and an address. someone she trusted with things she couldn't tell me herself. It was time to pay that person a visit. 3 days passed before I could get out of the house without Colt knowing where I was going. That might sound like an exaggeration. I was a grown man, 72 years old, in full possession of my faculties, but you have to understand the particular architecture of what Colt had built around me in that first week. It wasn't a cage. Cages are obvious. What he'd constructed was more like a very comfortable net, woven so gradually and so gently that by the time you noticed the weave, you were already inside it. He came by twice a day, morning and evening, reliable as the mail. He brought food, good food too, from the Italian place on Merchant Street that Miriam had always loved. He fixed the loose hinge on the back gate that I'd been meaning to get to for 3 months. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and talked about nothing consequential, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, a story he'd heard at the gym. He was by every observable measure an attentive and devoted son. He was also, I had quietly confirmed, calling people. The first call I overheard was to my cousin Raymond, Miriam's side of the family, a man I'd known for 40 years, who lived 40 minutes north in Claremont. I heard Colt's voice through the wall of the living room while I was making my way down the hall, and I stopped walking without making a conscious decision to do so. "Just keeping you posted, Uncle Ray. He seems okay on the surface, but between you and me, he's not processing things the way I'd expect." A pause, then lower. "Found some papers he claims Mom left for him. Keeps talking about them. I think the grief is hitting harder than he's letting on." I stood in the hallway with my hand on the wall and felt something cold move through me. Not anger, not yet. Something more precise than that. The feeling of watching a mechanism you've seen before, finally understanding what it's been built to do. He made a second call that same evening to Dr. Halliwell's office. I didn't hear the full conversation, but I caught enough. Concerned about my father. Sudden onset of confusion following the death of my mother. Would it be possible to schedule a cognitive assessment? A cognitive assessment. Not a grief counseling session. Not a general wellness check. A cognitive assessment, the kind that produces documentation, the kind that a probate court takes seriously when an adult child files a petition arguing that their parent lacks the capacity to manage their own affairs. By day 3, I understood the shape of it completely. To pursue guardianship in this state where we'd lived for the past 30 years, an adult child needed 2 things above all else: a doctor willing to sign off on cognitive impairment, and a paper trail showing the parent had been making decisions that weren't in their own best interest. Colt was building both brick by careful brick, with the patience of a man who had been planning this for longer than the past week. The question that kept me awake those 3 nights wasn't whether he'd succeed. It was how long he'd been planning it, and whether the death of his mother was the beginning of this story or merely the moment he'd been waiting for to start the final chapter. On the 4th morning, Colt called to say he'd be late. A work thing couldn't be helped. He'd come by after 6. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I put on my coat, picked up the address I'd copied from the bottom of Miriam's letter, and walked to my own car for the first time since the funeral. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I parked in the garage on 5th and Clement and walked half a block to a 3-story building with dark brick facing and a brass directory by the front door. 3rd floor. Suite 308. The elevator was slow. I didn't mind. I needed the extra minute. The door to Suite 308 had frosted glass and simple gold lettering, "Desmond Hale, Attorney at Law." I pushed it open. The reception area was small and well-kept, 2 chairs, a side table with a plant that was actually alive, which I'd learned to take as a good sign about a person. The woman at the desk looked up and said Mr. Hale was expecting me, which meant Miriam had thought even that far ahead. She'd told him I'd come. She just hadn't known when. Desmond Hale stood when I walked into his office. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, solid through the shoulders with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of steady, direct gaze that told you he'd spent decades listening to people say hard things and had learned not to flinch. He extended his hand across the desk. "Mr. Voss." His grip was firm. "I'm very sorry about Miriam. She was a remarkable woman." "She was," I said. My voice cracked on the second word, which surprised me. I'd held it together at the funeral at the graveside through 3 days of casseroles and condolences. Apparently, this office, this man who had known something about my wife that I hadn't, was where the crack finally showed. I pressed my lips together and sat down. "She told me you'd come eventually," Desmond said, settling back into his chair. He reached into the drawer to his left and withdrew a large manila envelope, thick and sealed, which he set on the desk between us. "She said, and I'm quoting her directly here, Harlan is slow to move, but once he decides to move, nothing stops him." Despite everything, I felt a small, sharp pain in the center of my chest that had nothing to do with illness. That was Miriam. That was her exactly in 14 words. "She left instructions," Desmond continued. "Specific ones. This envelope is for you only. You only opened in this office the first time with me present." He paused. "She was very clear that under no circumstances was Colt to know about this meeting or this envelope." "I gathered," I said. "Before I give this to you, I need to ask you a few questions." Standard verification, she asked me to confirm I was speaking to the right person. He glanced at the notepad in front of him. "What was the name of the diner where you had your first date with Miriam?" I blinked. Of all the things I'd prepared myself for walking in here, a quiz about our courtship wasn't one of them. "Patsy's," I said. "On Harbor Boulevard. She ordered the chicken pot pie and complained the crust was soggy the whole time." For the first time, Desmond smiled. It transformed his face entirely, made him look 10 years younger. "She told me you'd say that. She said you still brought it up every time chicken pot pie appeared on a menu anywhere near the two of you." 42 years, I said, and the crust was always soggy." He slid the envelope across the desk. I picked it up. It was heavier than Miriam's letter had been, considerably heavier. I ran my thumb along the sealed flap. "Take your time," Desmond said. "There's no rush." I opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, organized with paper clips and tabbed dividers, the way Miriam organized everything systematically, thoroughly, in a way that communicated she'd been thinking about this for a long time. The first page was a typed summary in Desmond's hand, dated 3 months before Miriam passed. The top line read, Rudy James Callum. Born July 14, 1983. Current address, 4417 Birchwood Lane, Clarksville. My eyes stopped on that name. Rudy Callum. The boy. The child she had given away. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was 42 years old, with an address 40 minutes from where I was sitting, and Miriam had known exactly where he was. "She found him," I said. "It wasn't a question. She hired me 7 years ago to locate him," Desmond said. "It took time. Closed adoption records are difficult to navigate, but yes, she found him." He let me absorb that before adding, "She never contacted him directly." I looked up from the papers. "Why not?" Desmond's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read, not discomfort exactly, but the look of a man choosing his next words with great precision. "Because by the time we located him, she had reason to believe that making direct contact could put him at risk." The cold thing moved through my chest again. From Colt. She didn't say that explicitly. Not in so many words. Desmond leaned forward slightly. What she said was that she'd become aware over the preceding few years that Colt was paying unusually close attention to her personal activities. Letters she received. Appointments she kept. She didn't feel safe reaching out to Rudy while that was the case. My hands tightened around the envelope. The papers inside crinkled softly. "She was protecting him," I said. The words tasted like something I'd swallowed wrong. "Yes." Desmond held my gaze. And in her letter to you, Mr. Voss, the one she left in the frame, she told you not to trust Colt. I don't believe that was paranoia. I believe she knew something about her son that frightened her, and she spent the last years of her life trying to make sure that when she was gone, you'd have everything you needed to handle it. The office was very quiet. Outside the frosted window, I could hear the city going about its business traffic, someone's phone, the distant three-note call of a delivery truck backing up. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that had no idea what was sitting in this room. I looked down at the papers in my lap. Rudy Callum, 42 years old, Clarksville. There's more, Desmond said quietly. When you're ready. I straightened the papers against my knee, squared them up the way Miriam would have, and looked at the man across the desk. Tell me everything, I said. Desmond opened a second folder. This one was thinner than the first, not because it contained less, but because what was inside had been distilled down to only what mattered. The kind of file a careful man builds when he knows every page might one day be read by someone who is already hurting and doesn't need extra weight. Miriam came to me the first time in the fall of 2016, he said, setting the folder open between us. She told me she needed to find someone. She was very calm about it. The way people are calm when they've been carrying something for so long that the weight has become normal. He paused. She gave me a name, a year of birth, the county where the adoption was processed. That was all she had. How long did it take? My voice came out steadier than I felt. 4 years to confirm identity, 3 more to locate current address. He turned the first page toward me, a printed record, official looking, with a case number along the top. Closed adoptions in this state seal everything. The birth parents' names, the adoptive family's names, the child's original birth certificate. To access any of it legally, you generally need either a court order or a mutual consent registry match, meaning both the birth parent and the adoptee have to register their willingness to connect. He tapped the page. Rudy Callum filed with the registry in 2018. Miriam never did. My chest squeezed. Why not? Desmond looked at me steadily. Because by 2018 she'd become aware that Colt was watching her. The words landed like a fist against a closed door, not breaking through, just making the whole frame shudder. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. She noticed things, Desmond continued. Small things at first. Her personal mail arriving already opened and resealed. Her journal moved from where she'd left it on the nightstand. A phone call she'd made to my office referenced casually in a conversation with Colt that she had never mentioned to him. He closed the folder briefly, then opened it again, as if deciding how much to give me at once. She believed he had found out she was hiding something significant. She didn't know how much he knew. But she was certain of one thing: if she made contact with Rudy and Colt discovered it, Rudy would become a target. So she stayed away. My throat was burning. She found him, and then she stayed away to protect him. Yes. Desmond's voice was quiet and very sure. That is exactly what she did. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. The burning in my throat spread upward behind my eyes, and I blinked hard against it, not trusting myself to speak until it passed. 7 years. She had known where her son was for 7 years, and never once let herself reach out, never once put herself first, because she was afraid of what Colt might do to a man who had never asked for any of this. She did see him once, Desmond said. I looked up sharply. He reached into the folder and withdrew a single photograph printed on regular paper, slightly grainy, taken from a distance with a long lens. A man in his early 40s, standing in the driveway of a small house loading tools into the back of a pickup truck. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired head bent in concentration. There was something about the angle of his jaw, the way he held himself with his weight slightly forward, that made my throat tighten for a reason I couldn't immediately name. About 3 years ago, Desmond said, Miriam asked me to arrange a way for her to see him, not to speak to him, not to introduce herself, just to see him. He set the photograph down. I drove her to Clarksville on a Tuesday morning. She sat in my car across the street for about 20 minutes. Then she asked me to wait, got out, and walked across. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair so hard my knuckles ached. She talked to him, briefly. He was working in the front yard. She walked up to the fence and he looked up. Desmond's voice stayed even, but something in his eyes went very careful. She asked him one question. Just one. She said, "Are you happy?" He looked at her a little confused, probably thought she was a neighbor he hadn't met, and he said yes. She nodded and walked back to my car. The burning behind my eyes became something I couldn't blink away anymore. I pressed my fingers hard against the bridge of my nose and held my breath for 3 full seconds. "That was all she let herself have," I said. The words came out rough, scraped, raw. "That was all she let herself have," Desmond confirmed softly. We stayed with that for a moment. Not a comfortable moment, but a necessary one, the kind that has to be lived through rather than rushed past. Then Desmond reached for the last item in the folder. Not a document this time. A single typed page, a summary neat and factual, the name at the top printed in plain black font. Father Glenn Merritt. Born 1954, Springfield, Illinois. Last known contact, 1983. My eyes stopped moving. Glenn Merritt. I read the name again. Read it a third time. Felt the floor of the world shift approximately 2 inches to the left. "Mr. Voss!" Desmond was watching me. "Do you recognize that name? Glenn Merritt." My own voice sounded far away, like someone speaking in another room. Glenn Merritt was my best friend. I set the paper down on the desk because my hands had started shaking badly enough that holding it felt dangerous. We grew up together, fished together every summer from the time we were 12. He was the best man at my wedding. I stopped, swallowed. He disappeared in 1983. Never called, never wrote. I spent 2 years trying to find him. Eventually, I stopped looking. I looked at Desmond and my voice cracked completely down the middle when I said Miriam told me she had no idea why he left. Desmond's expression was a careful, compassionate thing. "The file doesn't address his reasons for losing contact. That information isn't something Miriam shared with me." He paused. "I'm sorry, Harlan. I think she carried that particular part of it heavier than anything else." I stood up abruptly because I needed to do something with the energy that had nowhere to go. Walked to the window, pressed one hand flat against the glass and looked down at the street below, people walking, a bus pulling to the curb, a woman pushing a stroller, the whole indifferent machinery of a city that had no idea what was happening 3 floors up. My best friend. The man who'd caught the garter at our wedding and made a joke about it that had the whole room laughing. The man who'd helped me move into the house on Sycamore Street, who'd carried boxes in the July heat and complained so dramatically about it that Miriam had brought him lemonade just to make him stop. The man who'd vanished from my life without a word in the spring of 1983 and left a gap I'd eventually learned to stop noticing. He hadn't vanished. He'd run. And Miriam had spent the next 42 years sleeping beside me with that knowledge folded up somewhere beneath her ribs. "Is there more?" I asked the window. "One more thing," Desmond said, "before you go." I turned around. He held up a hospital record single page stapled in the corner. "Miriam was very specific that you see this before you meet Rudy Callum. She wrote in her instructions, and I'm quoting, 'Make sure Harlan reads the hospital file first. He'll understand why when he sees it.'" He held it out across the desk. I crossed back and took it from his hand. I made it as far as the 2nd floor of the parking garage. The elevator doors had barely closed behind me when I stopped walking, pulled the hospital record out of the envelope, and read it under the yellow fluorescent light between 2 parked minivans. I needed 30 seconds. That was all it took. Then I turned around and walked straight back to Suite 308. Desmond's receptionist looked up with mild surprise when I pushed through the frosted glass door. I held up one hand, not aggressive, just certain, and said, "I need 5 more minutes with him." She picked up the phone. 30 seconds later, she nodded me through. Desmond was still at his desk jacket on reading something. He looked up when I walked in, took one look at my face, and set the papers down without a word. I crossed the room and put the hospital record on his desk face up and pressed 2 fingers against the name printed in the witness section. "Rudy Callum," I said. "He brought me into Clarksville Regional on November 14th, 2023. That's him. That's the same man." "Yes," Desmond's voice was steady. "That's correct." Miriam knew. My voice had a rough edge to it that I couldn't smooth out. She knew he was the one who found me on that sidewalk. That's why she said to read this first. She wanted me to understand who he is before I walked up to his door. That's my understanding of her intention, yes. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down hard. My legs had developed an opinion about how much they'd been asked to hold up today, and that opinion was strongly negative. I rubbed both hands over my face, then looked at Desmond across the desk. "How did she find out?" I asked. "About the hospital, about Rudy being the one who brought me in." Desmond leaned back slightly. "Miriam called Clarksville Regional about 2 weeks after your admission. She told me about it afterward." He opened his desk drawer, retrieved a slim folder I hadn't seen before, and set it between us. "You were still recovering at home. She told you she was running errands. Instead, she drove to the hospital and spoke with the admissions coordinator, explained she was your wife, that you'd been brought in by a good Samaritan, and she wanted to send a thank you note." A pause. "They gave her his name." I stared at him. "She drove to the hospital herself." "She did. While I was home thinking she was at the grocery store." "Harlan." Desmond's voice was gentle but direct. She recognized the name the moment they said it. She had been looking at Rudy Callum's file for years by that point. His name, his address, his photograph. When the admissions coordinator read that name off to her over the phone, he stopped. "She knew," I said. "She pulled over on the side of the road and called me from the car," Desmond said. "I remember because it was a Thursday afternoon, and I was in the middle of a deposition. She left a voicemail. 3 sentences. He opened the slim folder and turned it toward me. A printed transcript, short-dated, November 28th, 2023. Des, it was him. Rudy was the one who found Harlan. I don't know what to do with that. Call me back. My eyes burned. I pressed my thumbnail hard against the edge of the desk to give the feeling somewhere to go. She never told me, I said. No. Desmond closed the folder. She called me back 2 days later and said she'd decided not to tell you. Not yet. She said you'd want to go find him immediately, and she wasn't ready for that. Colt was already watching her more closely than she liked, and she needed time to figure out how to do this safely. She was protecting everyone, I said, and my voice broke on the last word in a way I couldn't stop. She was sitting on all of this, the secret, the guilt, the knowledge that her son had just scraped her husband off a public sidewalk, and she was doing the math on how to protect everyone at the same time. I pressed my fist against my mouth for a moment. She never once told me she was carrying any of this. She carried it because she loved you, Desmond said quietly. And because she didn't trust herself to say it out loud without falling apart. In the 7 years I worked with her on this, I never once saw Miriam Voss fall apart. He paused. I think she was saving it all up for the letter. I sat with that. Outside the window, the afternoon light had shifted to something lower and more orange, the kind of late sun that makes everything look warmer than it is. Tell me about Colt, I said finally. Not what you suspect, what you know. Desmond folded his hands on the desk. What Miriam told me directly was this: approximately 4 years before she passed, she became certain that Colt knew she was hiding something significant. She didn't know how much he'd pieced together. But she described a specific incident. She came home one afternoon to find her personal address book had been moved. Not by much. Just enough that someone who knew exactly where she kept it would know it had been touched. The address book where she kept your business card, I said. Yes. A beat. She moved the card after that. Started keeping sensitive documents here in my office rather than at home. He looked at me carefully. She told me she believed Colt had been reading her mail, possibly accessing her phone when she left it unattended. She couldn't prove it. But Miriam was not a woman who imagined things. No, I agreed. She was not. The last time I spoke with her 2 weeks before she passed, she told me she was at peace with one thing. Desmond's voice dropped slightly, not from grief, but from the particular weight of a man delivering the last words of someone who trusted him with them. She said she knew you'd figure it out. That once you started looking, you wouldn't stop. She said. He paused, checking something in his memory, wanting to get it right. She said, Harlan is the most honest man I've ever known. If I can just get the truth into his hands, he'll know what to do with it. The burning behind my eyes became completely unmanageable. I stood up, not because I was finished, but because I needed to be vertical. Walked to the window again. Pressed my forehead briefly against the cool glass. Below the street was doing what streets do. In the late afternoon, people heading home, collars up against the October chill, everyone moving with that particular end-of-day purposefulness. None of them knew. None of them had any idea that 3 floors up, a 72-year-old man was standing at a window trying to hold himself together long enough to do right by the woman who'd loved him for 42 years and died still trying to protect him. What do I do now? I asked the window. Not helplessly, practically. I was done with helpless. I needed a next step. You go home, Desmond said from behind me. You act normal. You give nothing away to Colt. A pause. And when you're ready, you go to Clarksville. I straightened up, turned around, looked at Desmond Hale, who had kept my wife's secrets faithfully for 7 years, and handed them to me with both hands. How do I start that conversation? I asked. With Rudy. How do I walk up to a man's door and tell him his whole life is about to change? Desmond looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, You tell him the truth. In my experience, it's the only thing that works. I picked up the envelope from the desk, tucked the hospital record back inside, and shook Desmond's hand one more time. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, he said. You've got a long road ahead. He wasn't wrong. But I'd driven long roads before. Colt arrived at 6:15 with pasta from Carmine's. He let himself in with his key, a habit I'd never minded before, and was now very aware of, and called out from the entryway that he'd gotten the rigatoni because he remembered it was my favorite. I was sitting in the living room with a book I hadn't been reading, and I set it down and said that sounded fine. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did. Efficient, organized, setting out plates without being asked, because he'd grown up in this house and knew where everything lived. I watched him from the doorway and thought about how much of what I was seeing right now was real and how much of it was performance, and whether there had ever been a time when I could have told the difference. You look tired, he said, spooning pasta onto a plate. Did you sleep last night? Some, I said. You, not great? He set the plate in front of me and dropped into the chair across the table. I keep thinking about things that need to get done. The estate filing, the utility transfers, the investment accounts. He picked up his fork and then set it back down. Dad, I've been thinking it might be easier if I had signing authority on the main accounts. Just temporarily. So you don't have to drive to the bank every time something needs attention. There it was. Earlier than I'd expected, and smoother than I'd given him credit for. That's thoughtful, I said, and took a bite of the rigatoni. I talked to someone at the bank last week just to understand the process. He was watching me with that particular focused attention he'd had since he was a boy. The kind that was meant to look like concern, but always felt more like assessment. It's a simple form. Wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. I'd want my attorney to look at anything before I sign it, I said pleasantly. Force of habit from the business days. You know how I am. Something flickered in his jaw, not anger, more like a calculation being revised. Of course, he said. That's smart. There's no rush. We ate. He talked about a client of his who'd been causing problems, a neighbor dispute 2 streets over the fact that the gutters needed cleaning before winter. I nodded and responded, and ate the rigatoni, which was genuinely good, and the whole time I was watching his hands. Colt's hands gave him away the way most people's faces did. He was too disciplined with his expressions. Decades of managing clients had trained that out of him, but his hands still talked. Right now, they were restless, tapping the table edge, adjusting his fork, picking up his water glass and setting it back down in a slightly different position. The hands of a man whose plan had just been pushed back on a timeline he didn't control. After dinner, he washed the dishes again without being asked, and then pulled a folded document from the inside pocket of his jacket, with the practiced casualness of someone who'd rehearsed the moment. I had Morrison's office draw this up, he said, setting it on the table. Just a standard financial power of attorney. Temporary. Limited scope. He tapped the top of the page. You'd still be in control of everything. It just means I can handle the day-to-day without bothering you. I picked it up and read it slowly. Not the whole thing. I'd read enough contracts in my life to know that what mattered was what the document said, not what the person handing it to you said. It said, the scope was not limited. The duration was not temporary. What this document would do if I signed it was give Colt the ability to act on my behalf in virtually any financial matter without my direct involvement. I set it down and looked at my son. I'll have Desmond take a look at it, I said. His chin came up slightly. Desmond Hale. He handled some estate work for your mother. Miriam always said he was thorough. I kept my voice easy, like this was the most natural thing in the world. I'd feel better having someone review it. You understand? Of course, Colt said. For the first time all evening, the pleasantness in his voice had a hairline crack running through it. Take all the time you need. He left at 8:30. I walked him to the door, shook his hand, the way we'd always said goodbye because neither of us were huggers except at funerals, and watched his headlights back out of the driveway. Then I went to Miriam's sewing room. I hadn't been in there since she passed. The room still smelled like her, that particular combination of lavender soap and the cedar lining of her thread drawers that I would have recognized blindfolded in any building in the world. I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the frame and let the smell hit me square in the chest, which it did with considerable force. Then I went to the small filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out the folder Desmond had given me. I turned to the page about Glenn Merritt. I'd been avoiding it since I'd first seen the name. In the car in Desmond's office on the drive home, I'd known the page was there, and I'd known I wasn't ready for it. I was ready now, or as close to ready as I was going to get. The file was thin. A name, a birth year, a hometown in Illinois. A note that Miriam had provided his name from memory when she first came to Desmond in 2016. A line that said the investigator had been unable to locate Glenn Merritt at any current address, last known record, dated 1984, after which he'd effectively disappeared from public records. Disappeared. The same word I'd used for 40 years. I sat down in Miriam's sewing chair, the small wooden one she'd pulled up to her work table 1,000 times, and looked at the photograph of Glenn that I'd carried in my wallet since 1979. The two of us at the lake, 20-something, and stupid, with happiness squinting into the summer sun. Glenn with his arm around my shoulder, laughing at something one of us had said. You were there, I said out loud to the photograph, to the empty room, to whatever was left of 40 years of wondering. You were there, and now you're not, and she carried it the whole time. My eyes burned hot and fierce. My chest felt like something had reached inside and wrung it like a wet cloth. I pressed the photo against my sternum and sat in Miriam's chair in Miriam's room and let myself feel the full weight of it, not just the betrayal, because that wasn't the right word for it, but the loneliness of what she'd carried. The particular loneliness of a secret that can never be shared. After a while, I put the photo back in my wallet, put the folder back in the filing cabinet, and went to bed. Tomorrow was Saturday. I had a drive to make. I told Colt I was having breakfast with a retired colleague from the firm. He called at 8 to check in. That had become the new rhythm, a morning call and an evening visit. The infrastructure of a son keeping close tabs on a father. And I gave him the story easily because it was the kind of thing I actually did or used to before Miriam got sick, and the world shrank down to hospital rooms and home. "Drive safe," he said. "Call me if you need anything." "I always do," I said, which was true enough that it didn't feel like a lie. The drive to Clarksville took 42 minutes in light Saturday morning traffic. The October countryside looked like a painting someone had turned up the saturation on red and orange, and that particular deep yellow that only exists for about 3 weeks a year before the trees give up entirely. I had the radio off. I needed to think, and thinking required quiet. I'd been rehearsing the conversation for 2 days. Different versions, different opening lines, different ways to explain who I was, and why I'd shown up at a stranger's door on a Saturday morning with a manila envelope and a life's worth of questions. None of the versions I'd practiced felt right. By the time I turned onto Birchwood Lane, I'd decided to abandon the script entirely and just tell the truth, which was what Desmond had told me to do anyway. The house at 4417 was a single-story ranch, the kind of place that had been built in the 70s and updated in pieces over the decades. Newer windows, fresh paint on the trim, a front porch with 2 chairs that looked like they actually got used. A gray pickup truck sat in the driveway with the tailgate down. Tool bags. A coil of copper pipe. Someone was home and someone was working. I parked at the curb, sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and then got out before I could talk myself into driving away. The man in the driveway heard the car door and straightened up from where he'd been crouched beside the truck. He was taller than the photograph had suggested, an inch or two over 6 feet broad, through the shoulders, wearing work clothes, and the particular expression of a man who'd been focused on a task and wasn't immediately sure whether the interruption was worth his attention. Then he got a look at my face and something changed in his. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. It was subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tilt of the head, the look of a man who is seeing something he wasn't expecting and is trying to place it. I'd learn later what that expression meant. At the time, I just walked up to the edge of the driveway and said, "Rudy Callum, that's me." His voice was even careful. "Can I help you?" "My name is Harlan Voss," I said. "I was married to Miriam Voss. She passed away 3 weeks ago." Something moved across his face, then not shock exactly. More like the way a person looks when a word they've been expecting to hear finally gets spoken out loud. His chest rose on a slow breath. He wiped his right hand on his work pants and extended it. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Voss," he said. I know her name. I've known her name for a long time." His handshake was firm and rough-palmed, the hand of someone who worked with them. I held on a beat longer than a standard greeting, and he let me, which told me something about him right there. "Can we talk?" I asked. "Inside, if that's all right. I have some things I need to show you." He studied me for a moment, not suspiciously, just carefully, the way a man looks at something before he decides whether to trust it. Then he jerked his head toward the front door. "Coffee's on," he said. The inside of the house was clean and uncrowded, the kind of place that had exactly what it needed and nothing extra. A couch, a coffee table with a library book on it, a kitchen that opened onto the living room. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a wrench, was a child's drawing crayon red house lopsided sun. I noticed it because it was the only decorative thing in the room that wasn't functional. Rudy set a mug in front of me without asking and sat down across the table. He wrapped his hands around his own mug and looked at me with those steady eyes and waited. I put the manila envelope on the table. Before I explain why I'm here, I said, I need to ask you something. November 14th, 2023. Do you remember it? He didn't hesitate. Maplewood Avenue. Man down on the sidewalk. I called 911 and rode with him to Clarksville Regional. His eyes sharpened slightly. That was you. That was me, I said. He set his mug down slowly. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped just below his cheekbone, and he pressed his lips together hard, like he was holding something in that needed a moment before it could come out safely. When he finally spoke, his voice had roughened at the edges. I had no idea who you were, he said. I swear to God, I had no idea. I know that, I said. That's not why I'm here. Then why are you here, Mr. Voss? He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at me with an intensity that reminded me so sharply of someone I'd once known that my throat closed around the name before I could say it. Because a man named Colt Voss came to see me 6 weeks ago, saying he was a family friend, asking me questions I didn't understand the point of. And now you're sitting in my kitchen with an envelope and a face that looks like you've been carrying something heavy for about 3 weeks. His voice dropped. So tell me straight. What is going on? I looked at this man, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, who had knelt over me on a sidewalk 2 years ago and stayed until he knew I was safe and then gone home without asking for anything, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly. More like the particular solidness of knowing you're finally in the right place, talking to the right person about the right things. I opened the envelope. This is going to take a little while, I said, and some of it is going to be hard to hear. Rudy reached out and refilled both our mugs from the pot on the counter. Without getting up, just leaned back and grabbed it, the casual comfort of a man in his own space, and set it back down. I've got nowhere to be, he said. Before I tell you what Rudy found inside that letter, what name stopped him cold and changed everything I need to know, you're still with me. Drop "still here" in the comments right now. Every single comment means more to me than you know. Heads up, parts of this story have been shaped by fiction to carry the message further. If that's not for you, no pressure, step away now and find something that fits. But if you're staying, what comes next will hit different. I started with the letter, what I had of it. Not the whole story, not yet, but the pages I'd found behind the wedding photo. I pulled them from the envelope, unfolded them carefully, the way you handle something that has already survived more than it should have, and set them on the table between us. I had 4 of the 5 pages, 1, 2, 3, and 5. Page 4 was still missing. Someone had taken it before I found the letter, and I hadn't recovered it yet. Rudy looked at the pages without touching them, the way you look at something you sense is going to change things. My wife wrote this before she died, I said. She hid it behind our wedding photo. She asked me to find it. I pressed my finger to the bottom of the last page, to the line I'd read 100 times in the past 3 weeks. This is the last thing she wrote, but there's a page missing. Page 4. Someone removed it before I got here. Rudy leaned forward and read what I had. His lips moved slightly on the words. Then he sat back and looked at me, and his eyes were doing something complicated. Not tears, exactly. More the look of a man whose face is working very hard to stay composed, while the rest of him is catching up. She knew about me, he said. His voice came out lower than before. She found you 7 years ago, I said. She hired a lawyer to do it. Took 4 years just to confirm your identity because of the sealed records. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. She knew where you lived. She knew your name, your job, the address on Birchwood Lane. She knew all of it, and she never contacted you directly. Why? The word came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. His hands had curled around his coffee mug so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. Why would she find me and then just not say anything? Not even a letter, a phone call. Because she was afraid, I said. Not of you, of what would happen to you if the wrong person found out she'd made contact. Something shifted in his expression. Colt Voss, he said. Yes. He set the mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim onto the table. He grabbed a dish towel from the counter and wiped it up, and the motion was aggressive in a way that told me his hands needed something to do with what he was feeling. That man came to my door 6 weeks ago, Rudy said, throwing the towel back onto the counter. Said he was a friend of the family. Said he was helping sort out some estate matters after his mother passed. He turned back to face me, and there was a heat in his expression now, not anger at me, but the particular fury of a man who realizes he's been handled. He asked me if anyone had reached out to me about the Voss family, if I'd had any contact with Miriam Voss directly. I told him no, because at that point it was the truth. He pointed at the letter on the table. He already knew, didn't he? He already knew what that letter said. We believe so, I said. The letter was missing a page when I found it. Page 4. Colt was in the house before me. Rudy pressed both hands flat on the table and leaned his weight onto them, jaw tight, staring at a point somewhere between us. So he came here to find out how much I knew, whether I was a problem. Yes, and when he figured out I didn't know anything, he decided you were still a problem, I said. Just a future one. Rudy pushed off the table and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me, one hand gripping the window frame, and I could see the tension in his shoulders from across the room, the set of a man trying to work something very large through a space that wasn't quite big enough for it. After he left, Rudy said, still facing the window, I looked him up, Colt Voss. Took me about 10 minutes. His voice had gone flat and controlled, which I was learning was what Rudy Callum sounded like when he was most upset. The search results came back with Miriam Voss's name, her obituary, her photo. He turned around, and his eyes were red at the corners now, the skin around them tight. I sat with my phone in my hand for about an hour, because I knew I'd always known that Miriam Voss was my birth mother's name. I'd had it since I was 22 years old and filed with the registry. His voice cracked on the next words. And there she was, and she was already gone. My chest ached for him in a way that was physical, a genuine compression behind the sternum, the kind that doesn't come from anything medical. I wanted to say something useful, but there are moments when useful isn't what's needed. I'm sorry, I said. I'm sorry you found out that way. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket briefly hard. Did she know about me, about the registry? No, I said. Desmond, the lawyer, he found your registry filing and used it to track you down. But Miriam never registered herself. She was too afraid that if she did and Colt found out. I stopped. She was trying to protect you. That's the only thing she was trying to do. By staying away. His voice had gone raw and uneven. By staying away, I confirmed. Except once. He went very still. 3 years ago, I said. She asked Desmond to take her to Clarksville. She sat outside in the car for 20 minutes. Then she got out and walked over to where you were working in the front yard. I held his gaze. She asked you if you were happy. The sound that came out of Rudy Callum at that moment was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not a sob exactly, more like the sound a man makes when something he's been bracing against for years finally breaks through the wall. He turned back to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass, and his shoulders shook once hard, and then he got himself back under control through what was clearly a massive act of will. When he turned around again, his eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it. I remember her, he said. I thought she was a neighbor I hadn't met. She had gray hair, and she smiled at me, and she asked if I was happy, and I said yes, and she just... His voice broke. She just nodded and left. I thought it was a strange thing to ask a stranger. It was the only thing she let herself ask, I said. She never told me who she was. His voice cracked fully now, words breaking apart at the seams. She was standing right there, and she never said a single word about who she was to me. She couldn't, I said. She was terrified of what Colt would do if he found out she'd made contact. I paused. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for you. Rudy wiped his face with both hands, rough and unsentimental, the way men of a certain kind wipe away tears, like they're removing an obstacle rather than acknowledging an emotion. Then he looked at me with reddened eyes and said something that I hadn't expected. I knew she was gone before you told me, he said quietly. I'd been watching the name online, not every day, just sometimes. The way you check on someone you've decided not to contact. He swallowed hard. I saw her obituary. I read it 3 times. It said she was survived by her husband and her son. His voice went very careful on the next words. It didn't mention me, obviously, but I read it 3 times anyway. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He tensed for a fraction of a second. Surprise, and then his hand turned over and gripped mine back hard. The grip of a man holding on to something he hadn't expected to be offered. We stayed like that for a moment that didn't need any words put into it. Then I said, there's more I need to tell you. About Colt. About what he's been doing since she died. I felt his hand tighten on mine. And I need you to understand that whatever comes next, whatever Colt does, I'm not going to let him come after you. That's a promise. Rudy looked at me across the kitchen table with wet eyes and a jaw set like concrete and said, tell me everything, Mr. Voss. Harlan, I said. Call me Harlan. 3 days after Birchwood Lane, Colt stopped being subtle. I noticed it the moment he walked in Wednesday evening. The pasta was gone. He brought sandwiches, this time wrapped in deli paper, set them on the table without the usual ceremony. He sat down across from me with his phone face up instead of face down, which meant he wanted me to see that it was a busy phone. A phone receiving things, a phone connected to a world of activity I wasn't part of. Good day, I asked. Productive, he said. He unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite and looked at me with eyes that had a new quality in them, sharper, more direct, the careful pleasantness filed down to something closer to the bone. You went to Clarksville Saturday. I kept my face completely neutral. In 40 years of business negotiations, I had learned to keep my face neutral. I told you I was having breakfast with a colleague. You drove 42 miles for breakfast, he said. In the opposite direction from anyone you've ever worked with. My hands stayed still on the table. My breathing stayed even. Inside my chest, something cold and focused clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. I don't know what you mean, I said. Colt set his sandwich down. He picked up his phone, turned it toward me, and showed me a map application with a route marked on it. A blue line from Sycamore Street to an address I recognized immediately, Birchwood Lane, Clarksville. I installed a safety app on your phone 2 years ago, he said, and his voice had that particular calmness of a man who has decided to stop pretending. After you collapsed on Maplewood, you said it was fine. You said, he dropped into a brief imitation of my voice, whatever helps you sleep at night, son. I remember, I said. I can see where you've been, Dad. I've always been able to see where you've been. He put the phone down. Rudy Callum, that's who you went to see, isn't it? I looked at my son across the table and made a decision in real time. Not a decision to lie. I was past lying to him, or pretending we were past whatever we'd always been dancing around, but a decision about how much to give away and when. I went to Clarksville to meet someone your mother mentioned in her letter, I said. A person she wanted me to find. Rudy Callum is not someone you should be meeting with. Colt's voice had gone tight and urgent, the pleasantness completely gone now, like a mask he'd forgotten to put back on. Dad, I've been doing some digging on this man, and I'm telling you, there are things about him you don't know. What kind of things? He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone again. Navigated to something. Turned it toward me. A text message displayed on screen allegedly from a number I didn't recognize. The content was brief and pointed. You should know Rudy Callum has been asking around about the Voss estate. He's talked to 2 people in Clarksville about what Miriam might have left behind. Be careful. I read it. Read it again. My face stayed completely still. Who sent that? I asked. Someone who knows him, Colt said. Someone who's seen what he's been doing since Mom passed. He leaned forward. Dad, this man found out who you were, who Mom was, and now he's positioning himself to make a claim. That's what this is. He shows up at your door, he plays the Good Samaritan routine, and meanwhile, he's talking to people around town about what the Voss family might be worth. I set the phone down on the table between us and looked at my son. I thought about Rudy standing at his kitchen window, with his forehead pressed against the glass, shoulders shaking once, before he pulled himself back together. I thought about his hand gripping mine across the table, the roughness of the palm, the strength of the grip. I thought about a man kneeling on a sidewalk over a stranger staying in a hospital waiting room until he knew a stranger was going to be all right, going home without leaving a number. I appreciate you telling me, I said. Something in Colt's expression relaxed, not much, but enough. He thought he'd landed the point. He reached out and patted the back of my hand in a gesture that was meant to communicate warmth, but felt to me like a transaction being completed. I just want to protect you, he said. That's all I've ever wanted. I know, I said. He left at 8. I locked the door behind him, went to the kitchen and called Rudy from the landline. Not my cell, which had a safety app on it that I was now very aware of. Rudy picked up on the second ring. Harlan, your car, I said. Has anything happened to your car in the last few days? A pause, then, how did you know about that? My stomach dropped. Tell me. Yesterday morning, Rudy said, and his voice had that flat, controlled quality that meant he was very angry. Someone put a brick through the passenger window. Happened overnight. I filed a police report this morning. Another pause. Harlan, what's going on? I looked at the safety app icon on my phone screen. Thought about the text message Colt had shown me. Thought about the timeline Colt found out I'd been to Clarksville on Saturday. The brick through Rudy's window was Tuesday night. I need you to be careful, I said. Don't go anywhere alone at night for the next few weeks. Keep your doors locked. If anything else happens, anything at all, you call me first, before the police understood. You're scaring me a little, Rudy said. Good, I said. Stay scared. Scared men pay attention. I paused. I'm going to take care of this, but I need a little more time. How much time? I looked at the wedding photo above the fireplace mantel. The frame that had started everything sitting back in its place on the wall, like it had never held any secrets at all. Not much, I said. I promise. 3 days after Rudy's car window was smashed, I stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning. I'd lie in the dark and stare at the ceiling fan until the blades blurred. Then I'd get up, make coffee I never finished, and sit at the kitchen table with Miriam's folder spread open in front of me like a wound that wouldn't close. By mid-November, the mornings had turned sharp and cold, the kind that crept under the door and settled into your joints. I was 72 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt every single year of it pressing down on my chest. The call came at 8:15 on a Tuesday. Mr. Voss. The voice was female, clipped professionally neutral. This is Sandra Briggs from the Office of the Public Guardian. I'm calling to confirm receipt of a petition for limited conservatorship filed on behalf of one Harlan Edmund Voss. The petitioner is listed as Colt Raymond Voss. We've scheduled a preliminary hearing for December 2nd. You'll be receiving formal notice by mail, but the petitioner's attorney requested we make a courtesy call. My hand clenched so hard around the phone that my knuckles ached. I'm sorry. I said, keeping my voice flat, and even the way Miriam used to tell me I sounded when I was truly furious. Could you repeat the petitioner's name? Colt Raymond Voss, she said, listed as your son. And what grounds does this petition cite? A pause, the shuffle of papers. Cognitive decline, difficulty managing financial affairs, and documented incidents of erratic behavior and unsupervised travel. Another pause. Sir, I'd strongly recommend you retain independent legal counsel before the December 2nd date. I thanked her. I set the phone down on the table so carefully it didn't make a sound. Then I pressed both fists flat against the wood and breathed through my nose until the red haze behind my eyes began to thin. Erratic behavior. Unsupervised travel. The GPS map Colt had shown me a week ago, the red dot crawling from my driveway to Rudy's address on Birchwood Lane. He had been tracking me the whole time, and now he was using it as evidence. I called Desmond before the coffee finished brewing. He filed, I said the moment Desmond picked up, conservatorship, December 2nd. How long ago did you get the call? 11 minutes. Good. That means he filed within the last 48 hours. Harlan, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Desmond's voice dropped slow and deliberate, the way it got when the news was bad but manageable. A conservatorship petition is not a verdict. He has to prove incapacity in front of a judge, but he will come prepared. He will have a doctor's assessment, probably from your own physician, if Colt had access to your medical history. My stomach dropped. Dr. Halliwell, has Colt ever accompanied you to an appointment? Twice, I said, and the word tasted bitter. Last spring. He said he wanted to be there in case I forgot something. Then he may have spoken to Halliwell privately after those visits. We'll need to counter that with an independent neuropsychological evaluation. I know a Dr. Patricia Rowe over in Clarksville. She's testified for the defense in competency hearings before she's fast and she's thorough. A beat of quiet, the sound of Desmond's chair creaking. I also need you to tell me everything you've touched, moved, or signed in the last 30 days. He brought a power of attorney for me to sign about 10 days ago. I said, my voice going tight. I told him I'd have you review it first. He took it back. He took it back, Desmond repeated slowly. Harlan, is there any chance he presented a second document? Something shorter, maybe just a single page, and you signed it, thinking it was something routine. A receipt, a medical release, anything. The blood drained straight out of my face. I gripped the edge of the table. There was something, I said. After Miriam's funeral, he had me sign a form he said was for the funeral home, a final authorization for the cremation service. The pause on Desmond's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. I need to see that document. Can you find a copy? He kept the original. He said he'd file it. Then we subpoena the funeral home and Colt's attorney for all documents bearing your signature dated from September 15th onward. Desmond's voice was steady, but I could hear the controlled urgency underneath it. Harlan. He may have embedded a broader authorization inside a routine form. It's an old trick, and it holds up surprisingly well when the signer is grieving. My throat constricted so hard I had to force the next words out. He used Miriam's funeral to do it. We don't know that yet. But we have to act as if he did. A firm exhale. Get to my office by noon. Bring everything you have, the original letter, the folder from Miriam, any documents Colt left in the house. And Harlan. Yeah. Don't let him in this front door tonight. I hung up. I stood in the middle of my own kitchen. A kitchen where Miriam had made biscuits every Sunday for 43 years, where the wallpaper still had a faint coffee stain near the window that she'd never quite scrubbed out, and I felt the walls pressing in on me from every direction. My knees weren't steady. I grabbed the back of a chair and held on. He had used her funeral. He had stood at her graveside and shaken the hands of her friends, and then come home and fed me lasagna and slid a forgery across the table while I was still half blind with grief. A sound worked its way up from somewhere deep in my chest, not a sob exactly, more like something tearing loose that had been holding tight for weeks. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and stood there until I could breathe again. Then I went upstairs, got the folder, got the letter, and started the drive to Desmond's office. I had a lot to do before December 2nd, and this time I was not going to let my son walk me into a corner. Desmond's office smelled like old paper and wood polish, and for a long time after he pointed to line 9, neither of us moved toward the door. He used her funeral. I said again out loud this time because saying it once in my kitchen hadn't made it feel real. He did. Desmond pulled the document back, slid it into a clear protective sleeve. And I want you to understand something, Harlan. This is not a small thing he did. This is premeditated fraud on a grieving elderly man. A judge is going to take that seriously. He looked at me straight. But right now I need you to do something hard. What? Go home. Go through Colt's things. I stared at him. He doesn't live with me. He has a key, doesn't he? My jaw went tight. He does, and he's been in and out of your house since the funeral. Has he ever asked to store anything there? Box is a bag. Anything he said was temporary. I thought about it, and then my stomach turned over slowly, like a stone rolling downhill. He left a duffel bag in the hall closet, I said. Said it was winter gear he didn't have room for in his apartment. Desmond's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Harlan, that bag may contain the missing page. I drove home with both hands locked on the wheel, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. The November sky had gone the color of pewter, low and flat, and the bare trees along Clement Avenue looked like they were reaching for something they couldn't quite touch. I let myself in through the garage. The house felt different when I knew I was looking for something quieter, more loaded, every shadow a little darker than it should have been. I went straight to the hall closet and pulled the duffel bag out onto the floor. It was heavier than winter gear had any right to be. I unzipped it and found beneath a folded fleece jacket a small combination lockbox, black, no bigger than a shoebox, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for $30. My hands were shaking. I carried it to the kitchen table under the light. I called Desmond. There's a lockbox, I said. Combination, I don't know the numbers. Try Miriam's birthday, he said immediately. My throat clenched. I entered 0922. The box clicked open. Inside, folded once and pressed flat, a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Miriam's careful, slightly right-leaning script. The torn edge on the left side matched perfectly, heartbreakingly, the torn edge of the letter I had found behind the wedding photo. Page 4. My vision blurred so fast I had to set the page down and press both palms flat on the table. My chest felt like someone had reached inside and squeezed. Desmond, I managed. I found it. Read it to me. I picked the page up with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling, and read, Harlan, if you have reached this page, then you have already read the rest, and you already know about Rudy. What I could not write in the earlier pages, what I was too afraid to write, is this: Colt knows. He has known for 2 years. I found a printed copy of Rudy's birth record in Colt's desk drawer in February of 2023, and when I asked him about it, he looked at me the way he has looked at me since he was a teenager, when he wants something and believes he will get it. He told me to forget what I had seen. He told me that if I went to you, he would make sure you never believed a word I said. I am sorry, my love. I was a coward. I was afraid. But I could not leave this world without giving you the tools to protect what is yours and what is Rudy's. Do not let Colt take it. Promise me. I couldn't read the last line aloud. My voice had dissolved somewhere in the middle of that paragraph. I pressed the back of my wrist against my eyes and held the page against my chest until my breathing steadied. Harlan. Desmond's voice was careful. Are you all right? No, I said honestly. But I will be. I set the page down and looked at it. She was afraid of her own son for 2 years. She carried that alone for 2 years, and she didn't say a word. She found a way to tell you Desmond said quietly. The letter, the lockbox, using his own hiding place against him. She gave you everything she could. He stole it from her, I said, and my voice came out harder than I expected, not cracked, not wavering, just hard and cold and absolute. He stole it from her, and he sat in my house and had dinner with me and watched me grieve, and he never said one word. Harlan. A pause. I need you to photograph that page, the lockbox, and the duffel bag exactly as you found them before you touch anything else. Then I need you to bring all of it here. We file a motion tomorrow morning. With this and the forged funeral authorization, we're looking at petition dismissal, potentially criminal fraud charges, and full reversal of any document he had you sign. I took the photographs. My hands had stopped shaking by then, not because I felt better, but because I had moved past the part of grief that shakes you and into the part that makes you steady and cold and absolutely certain. When I was done, I stood over the open lockbox and thought about Miriam, not the Miriam in the hospital bed, not the Miriam at the end, but the Miriam who used to sit at this very table on Sunday mornings with a cup of coffee and the crossword, who used to hum without realizing she was doing it, who had been carrying a secret so heavy it must have bent her spine. She had been afraid. She had made mistakes. But in the end, she had trusted me enough to leave me a roadmap. I see you, Miriam, I said out loud to the empty kitchen. I'm finishing it. I picked up the lockbox, tucked page 4 carefully into Miriam's folder, and walked out to my car. Colt was about to find out that his father had been paying attention all along. Desmond filed the counter-motion at 9:17 the next morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting in his waiting room when his paralegal walked out and handed me a copy of the stamped filing, and the clock above the reception desk read 9:17. I held that stack of papers in both hands and felt something I hadn't felt since before Miriam died, a hard, clean sense of direction. Not hope exactly. Something steadier than hope. Purpose. He'll know by noon, Desmond told me when I stepped into his office. He was already in his jacket, a man who looked like he had been waiting for a fight for a long time and was privately glad it had finally arrived. His attorney gets notice the moment the court clerk logs it. I've included the forged funeral authorization, page 4, the lockbox photographs, and a sworn affidavit from you about the GPS tracking. I've also filed a motion to compel production of all documents bearing your signature from the last 6 months. And the conservatorship petition, I asked, stays on the docket for December 2nd, but now we walk in with a counterfiling and evidence of fraud. He leaned forward across the desk. Harlan, I want to be honest with you. Judges do not like discovering that a petitioner buried a forged authorization inside a funeral home document. That is not a clerical error. That is not an oversight. That is calculated deception against a grieving man, and it goes to the core of Colt's credibility as a petitioner. My jaw tightened. Good, I said. Let it. I drove home just before noon. The sky had gone the pale, washed-out gray of late November, and the neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. I had barely gotten my coat off when headlights swung across the front window. Colt's car. He was out of it before the engine had finished cooling, moving fast up the front walk, and I watched him through the side light glass beside the door, watched the set of his shoulders, the rigid line of his jaw, and I thought he knows. The notice had gone to his attorney. His attorney had called him, and now he was here. I opened the door before he could knock. Dad. His voice was tight and controlled, but his eyes were doing something I hadn't seen from him in years, darting restless, scanning my face the way they used to when he was 16 and had broken something and was trying to calculate how much I already knew. We need to talk. Come in, I said. He stepped inside and I closed the door and turned to face him. I had spent the drive home deciding exactly how I was going to handle this moment, and what I had decided was I was not going to raise my voice. I was not going to give him the argument he was expecting. I was going to let him talk first and listen to every word. I got a call from my attorney. Colt started moving into the living room, picking up speed the way he always did when he was nervous, and trying to hide it behind momentum. He says you filed a counter motion. He says you're claiming fraud. He turned to face me, and his expression had shifted, less defensive, now more wounded, performing a kind of hurt that made my stomach clench. Dad, I am trying to protect you. That's all I have ever been trying to do. Sit down, Colt. Something in my tone stopped him. He sat. I found the lockbox, I said simply. The color left his face so fast, it was like watching a blind come down over a window. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, gripped the fabric of his slacks. I don't know what you... Page 4, I said. The page you tore from your mother's letter. The page she wrote specifically because she knew you had found Rudy's birth record. The page she hid because she was afraid of you. I let that settle. Your mother was afraid of her own son, Colt. She told me not to trust you. She wrote it down. She signed it. She was sick, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Not with grief, I realized, but with something harder. Anger dressed up as grief. She was confused at the end. She didn't know what she knew exactly what she was writing. I leaned forward in my chair. My hands were steady. I made sure he could see that. She used your combination, your lockbox. She knew you would hide the page there because she knew how you think. She's been watching you for 2 years, Colt. Longer than you were watching her. He stood up. His jaw was working, the muscle jumping along the side of his face, and his eyes had gone bright and flat, the way a cornered animal's do. You don't have any idea what I've been protecting this family from, he said, his voice dropping low. That man, Rudy, whatever his name is, he is not your family. He is a stranger who came out of my mother's affair, and if you bring him into this house, into this estate, you are handing everything my parents built to a person who has absolutely no gal. He saved my life, I said. Colt stopped. November 14th, 2023. I collapsed on the sidewalk outside Crenshaw Hardware. I was unconscious for 4 minutes. I kept my voice even, measured, watching his face. The man who called 911, who stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, who gave the hospital his name, that was Rudy Callum. Your mother's son. My name was in his wallet inside of 6 months after that, Colt. He had looked me up. He knew who I was, and he stayed away because he didn't want to cause trouble. My throat tightened, but I pressed through it. He has been more of a son to me than you have been in the last 2 years, and he didn't even know my name when he did it. Colt's mouth opened, closed. His hands were shaking now. I could see it, the fine tremor running through his fingers, and for one moment he looked very young and very exposed, and I felt the ghost of something that might have been pity if the anger hadn't been sitting so much heavier. I want you to leave, I said. I want you to call your attorney and tell him to cooperate fully with Desmond's discovery request. And I want you to understand something, Colt. I am not doing this to punish you. I am doing this because your mother asked me to, and it is the last thing she will ever ask of me, and I intend to honor it. He left without another word. I heard his car back down the driveway too fast, the tires catching on the curb, and then nothing. I sat in the armchair for a long time after that. The house ticked and settled around me the way old houses do. My chest ached with the deep, bruised ache of something that had needed to happen for a very long time. She knew I kept thinking. She knew him, and she loved him anyway, and in the end she chose the truth. The courthouse on Fillmore Street had a smell that I remembered from the one time I'd served on a jury back in 1994, industrial floor wax and recycled air, and the faint metallic undertone of fluorescent lighting. It hadn't changed. Neither had the feeling of walking down that hallway with important papers under your arm, and the knowledge that what happened in the next hour was going to matter for a very long time. Desmond walked beside me, his briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been in this building hundreds of times and was not impressed by any of it. I was grateful for that. My own legs felt reasonably steady, but my heart was doing something complicated behind my ribs, not racing exactly, more like a slow, heavy thudding, each beat landing with the weight of everything that had led to this morning. "Remember," Desmond said quietly, as we pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the courtroom gallery, "you don't speak unless Judge Calloway addresses you directly. I do the talking." "Understood," I said. Colt was already seated at the petitioner's table, with his attorney, a trim man in a dark suit, whose name I had learned was Mitchell Farrow. Colt's back was to me, but when I took my seat, he turned, and for one moment our eyes met across the room, and I did not look away. I held his gaze until he was the one who turned back to his table and busied himself with a stack of papers. My jaw was tight. My hands were folded in my lap, and I kept them there, pressing one thumb into the opposite palm, steady and slow. Judge Calloway came in at 9:05. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and a manner that reminded me immediately of my high school principal, someone who had heard every excuse ever invented and was entirely immune to all of them. "We're here on a petition for limited conservatorship of the person and estate of Harlan Edmund Voss," she said, settling her reading glasses on her nose. "I have reviewed the petition and the counter-filing, and I want to address the counter-filing first because it raises concerns that I am not willing to table." She looked at Farrow over the rim of her glasses. "Counselor, your client is the petitioner. Would you like to explain to me how a document authorizing broad discretionary power over post-mortem estate matters came to be included inside a funeral home service authorization that the respondent signed 2 days after his wife's death?" Farrow stood. "Your Honor, that document was a standard administrative form provided by—" "I have the form in front of me," Judge Calloway said, and her voice carried the particular dry quality of someone who was not angry yet, but was actively deciding whether to become so. "Line 9 is not standard administrative language. Line 9 grants your client discretionary authority over, and I am quoting, all financial, medical, and property matters arising from or related to the estate of Miriam Ann Voss. That is not a funeral authorization. That is a power of attorney embedded inside one." The room held its breath. I could feel it, the particular stillness that settles over a space when something irrevocable has just been said out loud. Farrow's voice, when it came, was 3 shades quieter than before. "Your Honor, we would argue that the respondent's signature was given voluntarily. The respondent signed this document 2 days after his wife's cremation," she said, "while he was grieving, without independent legal counsel present, while being presented with a stack of papers framed as routine funeral paperwork." She set the document down. "Counselor, that is not voluntary consent in any meaningful sense of the term." Desmond rose beside me. "Your Honor, the respondent also wishes to submit into evidence a handwritten letter, page 4 of which was removed from the respondent's home and hidden in a locked container belonging to the petitioner. The letter was written by Miriam Ann Voss prior to her death, and names the petitioner directly as a source of coercion and fear." Judge Calloway extended her hand without a word, and Desmond walked the evidence to the clerk. I watched Colt's shoulders during that walk. I watched them rise with one sharp inhale, and then drop and stay very still, the way a person's shoulders drop when they've been holding a position for too long and can't hold it anymore. His hand moved to the table in front of him, fingers spreading flat against the surface. And I thought about Miriam, about the February morning in 2023, when she had found a copy of Rudy's birth record in her son's desk and looked up into his face and been told to forget what she had seen. She had been afraid for 2 years. She had carried it alone. My eyes burned. I pressed my thumb harder into my palm and held on. Judge Calloway read page 4. She read it twice, I counted. When she set it down, she pulled her glasses off and looked at Colt directly for the first time since the hearing had begun. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak. Before you do, I want you to understand that I have been on this bench for 14 years, and in that time I have developed a reasonably good instinct for when a petition has been filed in good faith and when it has been filed as an instrument of control." A pause that landed like a stone. "This is your opportunity." Colt stood. His face had gone the gray-white of old ash. His voice, when it came, was barely a voice at all, thin stripped of every layer of performance, just the raw sound underneath. "I was trying to protect the estate," he said. "I was trying to make sure that a stranger couldn't come in and—" "The stranger you are referring to," Desmond said, rising smoothly, "is the respondent's biological stepson, whose identity was concealed from Mr. Voss by the petitioner, and who I would note was the individual who called emergency services and remained with Mr. Voss during a medical emergency in November of 2023, at no personal benefit to himself." Colt's throat moved. His eyes cut to me, and what I saw in them in that moment was not defiance. It was not calculation. It was something I hadn't expected. It looked almost like loss. But I had spent too many evenings in his company, since Miriam's funeral, eating dinner at this table, and answering his questions, and signing his papers to let that look unravel me now. "The petition for conservatorship is dismissed," Judge Calloway said. "I'm referring the fraudulent document to the district attorney's office for review. Respondents' counsel, I'd like to schedule a follow-up hearing regarding the estate documents. December 16th, 9 a.m. She gathered her papers. "We're adjourned." I sat in that courtroom for a full minute after the gavel came down, my hands still folded in my lap, my heartbeat finally beginning to slow. Desmond put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "It's done," he said. "Not yet," I told him. "There's still Rudy." I drove to Birchwood Lane the morning after the hearing. The December air had a bite that felt personal, sharp, clean, unforgiving. The kind of cold that strips everything down to what's actually there. I drove with both hands on the wheel and Miriam's folder on the passenger seat the way I used to carry her purse when her hands were full. Rudy's truck was in the driveway. A blue tarp covered the rear window, the one Colt had smashed 3 weeks ago. Something about that small, patient repair made my chest constrict in a way I hadn't expected. He opened the door in a work shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows, joint compound, smeared along one forearm, the careful expression of a man who had been expecting this visit, but wasn't sure yet what shape it would take. "Mr. Voss," he said. "Harlan," I told him. "Please." The kitchen smelled like coffee and sawdust. He poured me a cup without asking, and set it between us the way people do when they want their hands to have something useful to do. I wrapped both palms around the mug and looked at him. This man who had his mother's coloring, her habit of pressing his lips together when thinking hard, her exact way of tilting his head left before asking a question. I opened Miriam's folder and placed page 4 on top. "Your mother wrote this 3 months before she died. She hid it because she knew Colt would destroy it." I watched his fingers curve around the page carefully, the way you'd hold something very old and fragile. "Read it." He read it. His face changed the way a sky changes when weather is coming gradually, then all at once. When he reached the last line, "Do not let Colt take it. Promise me," his hand dropped to the table, the page pressed flat under his palm. "She was afraid of him," Rudy said, his voice scraped down to the grain. "She sat across from me in that diner and asked if I was happy while she was going home to a son who was threatening her." "Yes," I said. "She was." A sound escaped him, low and involuntary pressure, finding a crack. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth, shoulders shaking with the effort of holding himself together. I didn't look away. I let him feel it because it deserved to be felt. I told her my life was good, he said, quieter now. I had my work, my house enough. I didn't know she was my mother. His eyes were red at the rims and very bright. She knew the whole time. She'd been following your life for years, through Desmond, the adoption registry. I paused. She knew about your dog. Rudy stared at me. Biscuit? Desmond's file had a photograph. His eyes flooded. She took a photograph of my dog, he said. She took a photograph of her son's dog, I said. He pressed both hands over his face and shook, not violently, but with the deep, quiet release of someone setting down a weight they hadn't known the full measure of until this moment. I reached across and held his forearm and didn't let go. When he lowered his hands, his face was wet, but his eyes were clearer. There's more, I said, about your biological father, Glenn Merritt. I slid the photograph across a man in his late 20s, broad shoulders, wide, easy grin squinting into summer sunlight. He was my closest friend for 17 years. I didn't know about him and Miriam until I found her letter. Rudy held the photograph at arm's length, then brought it closer. His chin trembled. He looks like me, he whispered. Around the jaw, I said, and the way he holds his shoulders. He set the photograph down carefully. Do you know where he is? Not yet, but Desmond is working on it. I leaned forward. There's one more thing. About money. He looked up. Your mother opened an account in '99. Monthly deposits for 22 years, small amounts, cash, nothing unusual. $237,000. Already transferred into a trust in your name. Colt never had access to a single dollar of it. Rudy's face crumpled, not with sadness, but with the overwhelming impact of being loved in a way you didn't know existed until the moment you found out. His eyes flooded. His whole body shook with the quiet devastation of a man who had spent his life believing he hadn't been wanted, now learning his mother had been counting dollars into an envelope every month for 22 years just to reach him. She never forgot me, he said, his voice completely broken. All that time, she never forgot me. Never, I said. Not for a single day. 2 weeks after the December 2nd hearing, Desmond's conference room felt different. The afternoon light came through the west-facing blinds in long, diagonal bars, cutting across 3 open folders on the table between us. December 16th. We'd spent the morning in Judge Calloway's courtroom watching Colt's fraudulent authorization voided in writing. Now the quieter work remained. The trust your mother established is already liquid, Desmond said, glancing at Rudy. $237,000 accessible this morning. Taunton Trust passed outside of probate. Colt never had legal access to it regardless of what he manufactured. Rudy's hands were flat on the table. He'd worn his good shirt pressed collar, the deliberate effort of a man who understood the weight of the day. And the main estate? Miriam's will was amended in August, 2 months before her death. Desmond turned a page. She named you as a beneficiary under your full legal name, Rudy James Callum. He paused. In the earlier version, the bequest was listed under a description. She changed it specifically to your name. I believe she wanted no ambiguity. Rudy's eyes went wide, then immediately wet. He pressed one fist against the table and looked at the ceiling jaw, working hard against a tide larger than he'd prepared for. She put my actual name, he said, his voice cracking clean down the middle. She did, Desmond said, gentler than I'd ever heard him. Rudy covered his face with both hands. A sound came out of him, rough and unguarded, the sound of a man who had been strong so long that the moment he was allowed to stop, everything released at once. I put my hand on his back and kept it there. Take your time, I said. I'm fine, he managed. You don't have to be fine today, I told him. There's no requirement. He lowered his hands, face raw and open. Sorry, he said. Don't be. Desmond and I said at exactly the same moment. Something loosened in Rudy's expression, not quite a smile, but the shape just before one. We spent the next 40 minutes working through documents. He asked careful, specific questions, investment accounts, Property, maintenance, joint trusteeship. Watching him, I thought of Miriam at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, reading every line before she signed anything. He had her mind. The same methodical, unhurried intelligence. When the last folder closed, Rudy looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, Colt." He said the name carefully. "Do you think any part of what he did came from fear, not just greed, actual fear?" I pressed my thumb into my palm. "He found out his mother had another child and decided to use it instead of telling me. Fear doesn't make that choice. You still make it yourself." Rudy nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. But I failed him somewhere too," I said. "I don't know where. But a man who loves his family the way I believed I did shouldn't end up with a son hiding lockboxes in a hall closet." "Harlan!" His voice was firm. "That is not your failure." "No," I agreed, "but I'm allowed to grieve it." Desmond slid the final document across. Last signature. Estate Amendment, Rudy James Callum, co-trustee. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I signed, set it down, and looked at the man across from me. The man who had driven a stranger to the hospital without asking for anything, who had kept his distance out of decency, who had sat in a diner with his mother without knowing it, and told her honestly that his life was good. "I didn't lose a son," I said. "I finally learned which one never deserved the name." Rudy reached across and took my hand in both of his firm, warm absolute. The grip of a man not letting go. "Thank you," he said, "for finishing what she started." I felt Miriam in the room, then quietly present the way she always was in moments she didn't want to interrupt. "I finished it," I told her. "I promised you, and I finished it." 3 days after we signed the final documents, Desmond called at 7 in the morning. I was at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching a cardinal work its way along the frozen bird feeder Miriam had hung from the back porch every November for 20 years. The phone rang, and Desmond's voice came through without preamble, the way it always did when the news was significant. "I found Glenn Merritt," he said. My hand tightened around the mug. Outside, the cardinal dropped from the feeder and vanished into the gray morning. "Where?" "Tucson, Arizona. 71, retired civil engineer. He's been there since 2004. A pause. "He never married. No children on record." I set the mug down because my hand wasn't entirely steady. No children on record. And yet, does he know about Rudy? That I can't tell you. But in 1974, Glenn Merritt filed a voluntary statement with the Cook County Adoption Registry. He'd fathered a child, placed for adoption, and wanted to be contacted if that child ever came looking. Desmond's voice was careful. The statement was never activated. Rudy never filed from his end. The air left my lungs slowly. I pressed one hand flat against the counter. "He's been waiting," I said. 51 years, Desmond said. "He filed that statement, and then he waited." I called Rudy before 9. He picked up on the second ring, already reading my voice before I said 3 words. "What happened?" "Desmond found your father, Glenn Merritt. He's alive, he's in Tucson, and he filed a statement in 74 saying he wanted to be found." My throat tightened. "He's been waiting for you to look for him." 4 seconds of breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man forcing himself upright against a wind that had just hit him full in the chest. "He wanted to be found," Rudy said, his voice rough and low. "He wanted to be found," I confirmed. Then unsteadily, "I didn't know to look." "I know, but now you do." I heard the scrape of a chair, the sound of a man sitting down hard, his legs making the decision before he did. "What do I do with that, Harlan? There's a 71-year-old man in Arizona who put his name on a piece of paper 50 years ago and just waited." "You call him," I said. "However you need to do it, call right drive to Tucson and knock on his door. But don't wait any longer. You've both already waited long enough." He made a sound, half laugh, half something that ached to hear. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't simple," I said. "But it's right. And you already know that, or you wouldn't be sitting down." A real laugh came, broken at the edges but genuine. You notice too much. Miriam always told me the same thing. I said, softer than I intended. The line went quiet, the warm kind. The kind that holds something rather than empties it. I'll call him Friday, Rudy said. He waited 50 years, I told him. He can wait until Friday. After I hung up, the cardinal had come back, sitting perfectly still at the top of the feeder, bright as a struck match against the gray December sky. I thought about Colt. The DA's review was open. Not yet a charge, but moving slow and certain, the way consequences always move. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was the exhausted sorrow of a father watching a child's catastrophic choices finally catch up one careful step at a time. But underneath the sorrow, quieter and more durable relief. The relief of a man who had stopped pretending, who had looked at the full truth of his family and chosen finally to stop looking away. She knew I thought watching the cardinal. She gave me the tools. I just had to be willing to use them. Christmas came to Clement Avenue, quietly pine and cold air, and the neighbors' lights blinking on at dusk, steady as a heartbeat. I hadn't put up a tree. Some things needed another year. But I'd found Miriam's wreath in the garage, pine cones and dried cranberries, the one she made with her book club, and I hung it on the front door, and that felt like enough. Rudy arrived at noon on Christmas Eve, his truck pulling in with Biscuit, the ancient shepherd, riding shotgun gray muzzle out the cracked window. I was on the porch when he stepped out, and his face was different. Something that had been braced and guarded had come down, leaving behind something quieter and open, like a window finally let up after a long winter. You called him, I said. He looked up and smiled wide, real, completely unguarded. 2 hours and 40 minutes, he said. My phone died. I had to finish on the kitchen landline. My chest tightened with something warm. How was it? His eyes went bright and wet at the corners. The moment I said, my name is Rudy Callum, and I think you knew my mother, he just started crying. His voice faltered. He said the hoping had hurt too much to keep doing, but he never stopped. I pressed my hand against the railing to stay steady. My eyes burned. Are you going to see him? January, Rudy said. Phone calls are a start, but they're not enough. He shook his head slowly. I have a father, Harlan, 71 years old, living alone with a cat, whose name I didn't catch because I was crying too hard. A sound came up from somewhere deep, half laugh, half the other thing. Come inside, I managed. It's cold. In the kitchen, while the coffee brewed, Rudy set a frame on the table. Simple, dark wood. Inside, a photograph I had never seen. A woman in her early 60s at a diner counter, coffee in both hands, head turned slightly left, caught mid-thought, the beginning of a smile on her face. Miriam. My legs went unsteady. I gripped the counter and stared at her. My wife of 43 years, more purely herself than any posed portrait we'd ever taken together. Desmond had it, Rudy said quietly. She gave it to him years ago. I thought you should have one. I carried the frame to the mantel and placed it beside our wedding portrait. The frame where this whole thing had started 3 months ago, the night I buried her. 2 frames. The woman I married and the woman she had also been running alongside everything I knew. Look behind the frames, I said aloud, her words, her handwriting, her last gift to me. Rudy stood beside me. She just needed you to be ready to hear it. I know, I said. I think I've always known. For the first time in 3 months, the house didn't feel like a place full of things I had lost. It felt like a place where something had been found. Merry Christmas, Rudy. He turned eyes, wet face, full of open and unguarded warmth, and said the thing I hadn't known I needed until the moment I heard it. Merry Christmas, Dad. My heart cracked open, clean and complete, not breaking, but making room. I pulled him close and held on and pressed my eyes shut against tears I made no effort to stop. I finished it, Miriam. Every last bit of it. You were right. There was so much more behind the frames. People ask me sometimes how I survived this, the betrayal, the grief, The loneliness of standing in a house full of secrets and having to open every single one of them by myself. I tell them what I believe with every year I have left. God doesn't hide the truth from you. He just waits until you're strong enough to hold it. If I'm being honest, and at 72 I'm done being anything else. I wasn't a perfect husband, and I wasn't a perfect father. I missed things I should have seen. I trusted the wrong person for too long, because it was easier than asking hard questions. Don't be like me. Don't wait for a hidden letter behind a wedding frame to start paying attention to the people who are actually showing up for you. Look at who stays. Look at who saves you without asking for anything in return. That's where your real family lives. A son isn't a name on a birth certificate. A family isn't just the people who share your blood. It's the people who choose you quietly, consistently, without applause. That's the family story. I didn't know I was living until Miriam made sure I couldn't look away from it. And I think that's the most important family story any of us will ever tell, not the one we planned, but the one that was true all along, waiting behind the frame. These are the grandpa stories I carry now, not with shame, but with the hard-won peace of a man who finally finished what his wife started. I hope one grandpa stories or two of them land somewhere useful in your chest. If any part of this story touched you, if it made you think of your own family, your own secrets, your own hidden letters, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this one, subscribe and stay close because I'm just getting started. Thank you truly for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. One more thing before you go, the stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and to carry a deeper truth. If that's not what you're looking for today, no hard feelings at all. Step away, find what feeds your soul, and come back when you're ready. The door stays open.